Now, you're not going to begin by reconstructing the argument that sums up 30 to 35 papers. What we're going to begin with is just taking small passages from the text that we're reading and reconstructing the argument in that small passage. So the first example that Khalifa gives you is a reconstruction of an argument from St. Augustine. And this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to be taking a passage that's about this length, sometimes 3 times this length, but it's going to be a page or less usually. And then you're going to reconstruct that argument. So let's look at this piece of text from Augustine. It is, however, without any delusive representation of images or phantasms that I am wholly certain that I exist, and that I know this fact and love it. So far as these truths are concerned, I do not at all fear the arguments of the academics when they say, what if you're mistaken? For if I am mistaken, I exist. He who does not exist clearly cannot be mistaken. And so if I am mistaken, then by the same token, I exist. And since if I am mistaken, it is certain that I exist, how can I be mistaken in supposing that I exist? Since therefore I would have to exist even if I were mistaken, it is beyond doubt that I am not mistaken in knowing that I exist. Okay, so this is a clever little argument. Students often, when they read this, if they haven't come across it before, they're shocked. They recognize this as an argument that Descartes makes in the Meditations, and that he puts forward as his own. So scholarly principles of citation have changed a lot. So Descartes didn't cite Augustine because he assumed that everyone reading him would have read Augustine. So that's a nice bit of text, but it's complicated in various ways. Okay, so here's Khalifa's reconstruction of that argument. It goes like this. If I can be mistaken about my own existence, then I exist. I can be mistaken about my own existence. Therefore, I exist. As you can see, this serves both of the purposes that we mentioned earlier. It takes a rather thorny piece of philosophical writing and makes it as clear as possible. It fits Augustine's argument into a common argument pattern known as modus ponens. Here's the modus ponens. This is probably the most common and most useful argument pattern, that is. If P, then Q. P, therefore Q. That's a valid logical structure. If you structure an argument this way, you know that if the first 2 premises are true, then the conclusion is true. That's what it means for an argument to be valid. If the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Okay, so that's a valid logical structure. And it also makes the argument that Augustine is putting forward as plausible as possible. The conclusion follows from the premises. Okay, so now I want to just say a word about the general structure of argument reconstruction. An argument reconstruction presents the argument in a standard form. That means it numbers each statement in the argument with the conclusion coming last. It presents its argument as an instance of a common argument pattern, and thereby presents it as valid. So you're going to make whatever the argument is, you're going to try to fit it into a valid argument pattern. So you know that if the premises are true, the conclusion is true. It's going to try to strike the right balance between faithfulness and charity. To be faithful to an argument is to accurately represent what the author is trying to say. And to be charitable is to represent the premises as true as much as possible. So what you're doing when you're reconstructing an author's argument is you're trying to strike the right balance between faithfulness and charity. So what does that mean? What's the right balance between faithfulness and charity? Well, you want to make the argument as strong as possible, because if you're going to argue against it, you don't want to be attacking a weaker version than what the argument really is. And if you're using it in your own argument, you want it to be as strong as possible. Okay, so making the argument as strong as possible is basically being charitable, trying to make sure to ensure that the premises are true. However, you're reconstructing an argument, so you don't want to turn the argument into something that the author didn't actually write. And that's where faithfulness comes in. So if you feel like you get to a point where you've made an argument that is actually better than the argument that the original author made, then you can say, look, this is inspired by that argument, but it's not the same thing as that argument because that author failed to see this particular point. At any rate, in all cases of reconstruction, you're striving for fidelity, for being charitable, and that means trying to accurately represent what the author said, but also trying to help the author out and trying to make the premises seem as true as possible. So argument reconstruction, as I'm going to present it, has 4 basic steps. Put the argument in standard form, simplify the language as much as possible, paraphrase the premises and conclusions until they fit a common argument pattern. And then finally, you evaluate the premises. right? So that's when you do the actual work of determining whether or not the individual premises are true. Now, Khalifa, if you read his tutorial, he has a fifth step called fine-tuning the argument, but I'm going to leave that out for the sake of simplicity.